They told you history was written in ink. They lied. The truth is written in blood, and buried so deep you were never meant to find it. It began in the winter of 1847 when 101 men crossed the last snow-bridged pass into a place the maps no longer name. North Pine Basin, they called it then, a clearing carved into the spine of a black forest, too far north for rescue, too far from law for justice. Men said they came for timber and wages. That was the story, but stories are bait, and every man who walked into that basin was prey. I was there, though not as a lumberman. My hands were made for ink, not axes. The company had hired me to keep their ledgers, track their stores, count every barrel and every lantern's worth of kerosene. A harmless post, or so I believed. But numbers. Numbers tell their own kind of truth. And when truth is dangerous, the man who writes it down becomes a problem. The foreman, Harker, ruled without shouting. His voice never rose above a calm order, yet men obeyed him as if their lives depended on it. Maybe they did. Beside him always the cook, Braddock, thin, watchful, with knives that gleamed like mirrors. Meals were simple at first: pork, beans, boiled potatoes. But the forest wastes no time in showing its teeth. Within the first week, a deer was found hanging upside down at the edge of camp, gutted, untouched. A prank, some said. A warning, others whispered. Supplies began thinning sooner than my books allowed. Barrels half filled, flour gone before the month's turn. By the third week there was no meat left. At least, none I could account for. And then came the snow, a slow fall that never stopped. By morning it lay waist-deep, burying the trails we'd taken in. The sled dogs refused to run. We were sealed in, and the change was immediate. Laughter around the fire turned to silence. Men ate without speaking, or walked the camp at night asking how we slept. Most lied. The first death was called an accident. I saw it for what it was, a move. And that night, meat returned to the stew, thicker, darker, tasting of pepper and iron. I didn't finish my bowl. By the second week, the forest had learned our names. Every man's strength, every hesitation, every whispered fear. It was catalogued, studied and used. I began keeping a secret ledger, one meant for no eyes but mine. I wrote what the company could not afford to exist on paper. The missing men, the altered rations, the subtle changes in the cookhouse air that smelled of metal and something sweet, something wrong. 17 men vanished in a single morning. No orders had been given, no gear signed out. Harker's calm gaze met mine when I asked about them. Some men just leave, he said. His eyes were empty but precise, a statement that told more than any shout could. Some men left because they were meant to leave and never return. The remaining men began changing. Those chosen by Harker for the new core teams carried a quiet certainty in their step. They moved differently, ate differently. There was a rhythm to their brutality, a controlled efficiency in every swing of the axe. Those outside the circle grew weaker. I watched them waste away, their faces hollow under the cold sun, yet none protested. None fled. The snow had sealed us in. Yes, but it was the system, the invisible structure of fear and reward, that kept us bound. I saw it in the small things. A token left under a pillow, carved with a saw blade wrapped in flame. An invitation, a warning. I did not know which. The next day, Wexley Coates was sent alone into the southern woods, a known danger zone. Strong men do not work alone, I told myself, and yet he did, because he was chosen. By nightfall, he was gone. No search party, no alarm, only the silence of a forest that had learned patience, and a camp that had learned obedience. And the stew, always the stew, thick, dark, seasoned with unknown truths, served without question. Eating it was survival or complicity. I did not eat. I stored the portion, as secretly, as evidence, as proof that someone was counting, always counting. And then I understood. The operation had a logic. It was not chaos. It was design. Men disappeared, others were elevated. Fear and reward wove a web tighter than the snowbound forest, and I, ink-stained and trembling, began to see the outlines of the machine. This was not a logging camp. This was a crucible. The forest did not just surround us. It became part of the system. Every step through the waist-deep snow was measured, every sound amplified. The men who remained spoke in quieter tones, their laughter stripped away, replaced by a rhythm of caution. Even the wind seemed to watch. I realized then that the boundaries of the camp were not the trees themselves, but the fear embedded in every man's mind. One night I followed Braddock to the ice pit behind the cookhouse. He dragged a sled, moving silently, carefully. Harker stepped from the shadows and they spoke without raising their voices. I could not hear the words, only the certainty of coordination, the forest itself yielding to their command. The pit, once said to hold ice, was a vault for something far darker. Drag marks in the snow told me stories the men would never speak aloud. By the third week, the hierarchy had solidified. 12 men were selected for extra rations, longer shifts, and access to the inner workings of the camp. All others were left with scraps, shadows of themselves. Those who ate from the foreman's stores grew stronger. Those who relied on Braddock's pot grew weaker. Obedience and hunger became the same thing, and still no one complained. None dared. I began to see patterns in the disappearances. Names vanished from the roster, replaced by blanks. Some were gone without trace, others left remnants. A glove, a boot, a smear of blood. I stored what I could, keeping secret ledgers, marking dates, observing rhythms. There was a method to the madness, a shape forming in the snow and shadows, guiding the men like pieces on a board, and the board had its masters. At night I could hear whispers not carried by mouths, but by the forest itself. Small sounds, the scrape of boots over ice, the faint click of knives against metal, all registering in the corners of my mind. I realized then that silence was not absence, silence was currency. Speak too much, question too loudly, and you became a liability. That night, a token appeared under my pillow. A saw blade wrapped in flame, no explanation, no signature, just a signal that someone or something was watching, shaping, testing. I understood then that survival was no longer about strength. It was about perception, about learning the rules of a game I had not agreed to play, and as I traced the carved blade with my thumb, I made a silent vow. I would see the edges of this operation, whatever it cost me. The first man to vanish from the new order was Ryland Hayes. He had been one of the few who still spoke to me freely, a card player, a teller of small jokes, a reminder of life before the snow swallowed us whole. One morning his bunk was empty, boots gone, no note, no explanation. Harker's voice, calm and detached, told me, "Some men just leave. Too much cold makes them run." But I knew better. Hayes did not run. He had been selected and removed. After his disappearance, the camp shifted again. Men moved like shadows, cautious in their steps, careful with their words. The ones chosen for the inner circle carried a confidence that chilled me. They were no longer lumbermen. They were instruments, each step measured, each motion precise. Obedience was rewarded, hesitation punished in ways no ledger could record, and the stew, always the stew, served thick and dark, a silent marker of compliance. Eat or disappear. I began to watch the cookhouse more closely. Braddock no longer merely prepared meals. He administered them, observing the men as they ate, noting who lingered, who refused, who questioned. The forest, the snow, the camp, all were part of a larger design, a system built on hierarchy, fear, and absolute control. Those who resisted in the slightest found themselves alone, reassigned to dangerous zones, or simply gone. One evening I saw Arvd Kudsen's disappearance unfold without intervention. He had gone to chop wood, a routine task, yet never returned. I found his axe resting against the sawmill wall, pristine, untouched, as if he had never been there. When I approached Harker with questions, his gaze was a lesson in authority. "Do you think I am unaware?" he asked. The words were calm, but the message was unmistakable. Curiosity had limits. Step beyond them, and the forest itself would answer. By now, the system was clearer. 12 men were elevated, the rest left to dwindle under cold and hunger. The snowbound isolation was only part of the trap. The true control was psychological. Observation, subtle rewards, the constant reminder that everything was being recorded, every move catalogued. Survival became obedience, obedience became complicity, and I, with my hidden ledgers, was both witness and participant. The forest had taught me one undeniable truth: strength alone would not save you. Understanding the machine, seeing its patterns, knowing who had power, that was the only path, and for men like Hayes and Knudsen, that knowledge had come too late. By the 4th week, the 12 men chosen for the inner circle had begun to change. It was subtle at first: a straightened posture, a careful step, a look that lingered just long enough to measure. But slowly, the transformation became unmistakable. They moved with authority, even over men older or stronger than themselves. Fear had been converted into power, and those who had once joked and argued now obeyed without hesitation, their minds shaped by rituals unseen, rules unspoken. The forest seemed to acknowledge them, bending around their presence. Trees that had been walls now became corridors, guiding their work, guiding their decisions. Harker watched silently from the shadows, satisfied, as if he were cultivating a crop, and the men were his harvest. Each day they were fed, strengthened, and tested. Those who faltered were sent into the outer edges of the woods, dangerous zones where logs shifted without warning and snow swallowed footprints in minutes. Some returned, some did not. I kept my ledger hidden, documenting each change, every disappearance, and every shift in behavior. Braddock's meals became more than sustenance. They were instruments of control. The stew, thick and seasoned with unknown flavors, marked those who belonged and those who did not. Eating from it was both a blessing and a surrender. Those who refused became weaker, isolated, and more susceptible to fear. One evening, I followed the 12 as they gathered near the ice pit. Braddock and Corley were there, moving quietly, purposefully. A canvas-wrapped bundle was lowered into the pit. I could see only the shadowed figures, but the precision of their movements left no doubt. This was part of the system, a calculated act of reinforcement. The forest echoed with silence, the kind of silence that demands attention, obedience, and submission. It became clear that survival was no longer a matter of skill or strength. It was about perception, about understanding the rules of this deadly hierarchy, and adapting. The 12 were no longer men. They were instruments, shaped by fear and reward into extensions of the camp's will. And for the rest of us, the lesson was clear: comply or vanish. Every night as I traced the carvings on the token I had found, I realized the forest was teaching more than survival. It was teaching obedience, and the price of knowing too much was exact. Every man who entered the basin carried this knowledge, and many would never leave with it intact. It happened the night Wexley Coates disappeared. He had been assigned alone to the southern tree line, a known danger zone where logs shifted unexpectedly and snowdrifts disguised deadly drops. I followed at a distance, hoping to witness the truth without being noticed. The wind carried only silence. The snow swallowed his tracks almost immediately. And then, nothing. No sound, no struggle. Just absence. By morning, the camp had already moved on. No search party, no alarm, only the measured steps of men who understood that survival was tied to silence. Braddock moved with purpose, feeding the 12 inner men with larger portions, richer flavors. The rest received scraps. Hunger and obedience had now become intertwined. The forest, the snow, and the camp, all were now instruments of the same operation. I began to record every detail, aware that my ledger was both my weapon and my shield. The first eliminations were precise, methodical, almost clinical. Hayes, Knudsen, Wexley, all gone. Each disappearance left a subtle mark on the remaining men: hesitation in their steps, quickened glances over shoulders, silent questions that dared not be asked. Fear had entered a new phase. It was no longer a threat, it was a teacher. Then I saw it, unmistakable: Corley and Monroe speaking quietly to Braddock behind the supply shed. A ledger lay open on the crate, pages fluttering in the wind. I realized then the reach of the operation. No ledger was private, no act unseen. They had access to everything, could manipulate anything, even my secret notes. That night, a fresh blank ledger appeared on my bunk. No signature, just one command: rewrite it, or else. I began to understand the depth of the system. It was not punishment, it was refinement. Those chosen to survive were molded, elevated, reshaped by fear and reward into something else entirely. The rest? They disappeared quietly, efficiently, leaving only traces, reminders that the forest and its masters were always watching. Silence was rewarded. Obedience became survival. Knowledge was dangerous. And the forest was patient, hungry, precise. It waited for men to falter, to misstep, to doubt. Each disappearance reinforced the power structure, tightening the invisible chains that bound the living to the will of Harker and his chosen instruments. I began to realize that the forest had its own consciousness, a dark intelligence that aligned with human design. The logging camp was no longer a place of work. It was a crucible, a laboratory, a system designed to test, shape, and eliminate. And I, with my hidden ledgers, was caught in the experiment. By now, the 12 men of the inner circle were no longer the same. Their faces held a certainty that unsettled even the most experienced loggers. Eyes sharp, movements deliberate, they carried a confidence born of obedience but sharpened into dominance. The forest seemed to bend around them, trees framing their path, snow yielding silently beneath their boots. Each man was a product of the system, a living instrument forged by Harker's unseen hand. Even simple tasks became lessons in hierarchy. Chopping trees, stacking logs, clearing paths, every action measured, every failure noted. Braddock's meals were no longer merely nourishment, they were tools of influence. Rich, seasoned, and intentionally portioned, they marked those who belonged in the inner circle and those who were expendable. Hunger now dictated allegiance, obedience had become instinct. I began to see subtle tests unfold. One evening, Laurent Jorvik was sent to the edge of a dangerous ravine alone. A misstep, a snow-covered drop, and he would vanish without a trace. The men in the inner circle observed silently, their faces unreadable, as if the fall were part of the natural order. It was not cruelty, it was precision, a system of natural selection, engineered and deliberate. And then there were the tokens, small carved pieces left under pillows, in bunks, or along the snow-covered paths. Each bore symbols I could not yet understand. Saw blades entwined in flames, geometric shapes, marks that seemed almost alive. They were signs, tests, or warnings. Whoever controlled them controlled perception itself. I kept mine hidden, tracing the carvings nightly, understanding that it was not just protection, it was a tether to the system's hidden design. The remaining men outside the 12 began to fracture under the weight of observation. Conversations grew cautious, laughter disappeared, and glances of her shoulders became constant. Survival was no longer about skill with an axe or endurance in the cold. It was about reading the invisible lines of power and choosing carefully when to act, when to speak, when to move. Misstep, hesitation, curiosity, any could mark a man for disappearance. It was at this point I understood the full scope. The forest, Harker, Braddock, Corley, Monroe, all were part of a single organism, and we, the men trapped in the basin, were both its subjects and its instruments. Every act, every choice, every heartbeat became data, recorded, observed, and weighed. Knowledge was dangerous, obedience was rewarded, and the forest, patient and eternal, demanded absolute understanding. It began with Stennis, one of the 12. Strong, stoic, respected by all, and now a symbol of what obedience could achieve. But that night, something changed. He collapsed mid-shift beside a felled tree, no injury, no visible cause. Men froze, no one rushed. Harker appeared, calm as ever, and silently signaled Braddock and Corley. They lifted Stennis and carried him to the cookhouse. I followed at a distance, heart pounding, drawn into the ritual of the unknown. Behind the cookhouse, they lowered him into the ice pit. Hours passed. The scent of roasted meat soon drifted across the camp. When the doors opened, the 12 entered silently, bowls in hand, and ate without hesitation. Satisfaction glimmered in their eyes, a confirmation, a transformation completed. Stennis emerged hours later, changed. His posture straightened, his gaze sharper, his authority palpable. Fear had been replaced with control. Obedience had been internalized as power. The rest of us watched in silence. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath, acknowledging the change. Survival was no longer just about enduring the cold or lifting timber. It was about understanding the unseen rules, the invisible hierarchies, the lessons enforced by absence, fear, and subtle ritual. The Chosen had been remade, elevated by a system we barely glimpsed, a mechanism both human and merciless. I kept my ledger hidden, recording every detail. Each transformation, each disappearance, each subtle shift in behavior revealed a truth far more dangerous than the snow or the logs. Knowledge here was both weapon and curse. One wrong observation, one misstep, and a man vanished. One act of understanding, one subtle acknowledgement of the system, and he became part of it. By now it was clear, the forest, the camp, Harker, Braddock, Corley, Monroe, all were instruments of a design far larger than mere logging operations. Men were tested, selected, elevated, or removed according to rules only the system itself understood. And I, scribbling in the hidden ledger, realized my role had shifted. I was no longer merely witness. I was participant, observer of a hierarchy that rewarded fear, obedience, and the surrender of autonomy. That night I traced the token beneath my floorboard, understanding that symbols carried the weight of power. And in the dark I whispered to myself the truth the forest was teaching us. Strength alone could not save a man here. Only understanding, only adaptation, only recognition of the system could. By the 5th week the camp's atmosphere had grown almost unbearable. Hunger, cold, and fear had become intertwined, a web that ensnared every man who had not yet been elevated into the inner circle. Meals were measured, portions carefully controlled. Those chosen for the inner 12 received richer, heavier servings, the rest scraped by with thin broth, dry biscuits, and the bitter taste of resignation. Hunger was no longer just physical. It was a tool, bending minds, breaking resistance, sharpening obedience. The disappearances continued with precision. Ryland Hayes, Arved Cudson, Wexley Coates, all gone. No explanation, no recovery, only the faintest traces. A blood-stained glove, a boot half buried in snow, a drag mark erased by the relentless blizzard. Each absence served as a lesson. Each man who remained understood without question that curiosity or hesitation could be fatal. Survival demanded silence and compliance. I watched Braddock sharpen his blades in the quiet hours, the metal catching the dim light of the lantern, a ritual as deliberate as any in the camp. His movements, precise and calm, revealed that this was no ordinary cook. He was the enforcer of order, the unseen hand that ensured the system's designs were executed flawlessly. Corley and Monroe were equally essential, their quiet coordination with Harker ensuring that each selection, each elimination, reinforced the hierarchy without chaos or suspicion. I realized then that my ledger was the only true witness. It recorded not just the events, but the design, the pattern of fear, hunger, and obedience. Each entry I made felt heavier than the last, as if the ink itself carried the weight of the system's intent. I hid it, but I knew that one day someone would read it and understand. Someone would see the truth behind the snow, the logs, and the disappearing men. The forest seemed alive with awe, awareness. Snow muffled sound, but it amplified tension. Every snap of a branch, every creak of timber, every whisper of wind became a potential signal, a reminder that the eyes of the system were everywhere. I began to understand that North Pine was not merely a logging camp. It was a laboratory of the human mind, a crucible designed to test the limits of obedience, fear, and survival instinct. And I, Elias Vaughan, was trapped in the middle, forced to witness, forced to record, forced to survive. Each day, the line between witness and participant blurred. The forest demanded loyalty, and those who faltered disappeared without trace. The 12, elevated by fear and ritual, moved through the camp like shadows of inevitability, silent reminders that power was both a reward and a tool. Tension reached a new pitch when a small group of men, the ones who had not yet been absorbed into the inner 12, began whispering in corners. Frustration, fear, and hunger combined into a dangerous cocktail. They questioned the disappearances, murmured about unfair treatment, and dared to speculate about what was truly happening in the forest. I listened quietly, recording every word, every glance, every tremor of doubt in my ledger. Curiosity was the first step toward annihilation. Harker noticed, of course. He never confronted them openly, never raised his voice. That was not his method. Instead, he manipulated the system with invisible strings. Shifts were rearranged, supplies subtly shifted, and tasks were assigned that isolated each man. The forest itself became part of the punishment. Those who questioned were sent alone into the south woods, into snowdrifts concealing deadly drops, into paths that led nowhere but danger, obedience or disappearance. The choice was made for them. Braddock and Corley executed these assignments with a calm precision that chilled me. I saw men leave for work looking confident, only to vanish hours later. The snow erased evidence, the wind carried silence, and the camp remained unchanged, as though nothing had occurred. Fear spread not through noise, but through absence, the slow erosion of certainty. Survival was now dictated by comprehension, not strength. Meanwhile, the inner 12 observed. Their presence alone exerted pressure, an unspoken dominance that reminded everyone of the system's hierarchy. Meals, rations, and even casual glances reinforced allegiance. The forest and the camp had become instruments of psychological control, their influence shaping behavior as effectively as the cold or hunger. Every man understood one wrong move, one whispered question, and he might be the next to vanish. I recorded it all, K.E. Knowing my ledger was my only tether to truth. Every disappearance, every subtle manipulation, every silent lesson was etched into its pages. And yet the system was teaching more than obedience. It was forging new minds, molding survivors into extensions of its will. Those elevated by fear became masters of manipulation themselves, capable of perpetuating the system without conscious thought. It became clear, rebellion was impossible. The forest had swallowed the weak, elevated the obedient, and erased dissent. And I, hidden in the shadows, writing in my ledger, realized that knowledge alone was both a weapon and a curse. To see the design was dangerous, to act on it was potentially fatal. It was Corley who first demonstrated the full extent of the system's power. A man once quiet, observant. Now he moved with deliberate authority, eyes sharp, gestures calculated, and voice controlled. He was no longer merely a participant. He had become a mechanism of enforcement, a human extension of Harker's invisible hand. Every action he took reinforced the hierarchy. Every instruction he gave shaped behavior, and every glance reminded the remaining men of their vulnerability. I watched him assign tasks with precision, sending weaker men into dangerous zones, making their survival dependent entirely on adherence to the unseen rules. Hunger, cold, and fear were instruments in his hands. He delivered them not as punishment but as necessity. Men obeyed not because of loyalty, but because they understood the cost of hesitation. Those who faltered vanished quietly, erased from the ledger, from memory, from existence. Braddock's role too became clearer. He prepared meals with meticulous care, not merely for sustenance but as a tool of control. The rich, hearty portions marked the inner 12, signaling favor, allegiance, and acceptance. Thin broths and dry biscuits were assigned to others, reinforcing hierarchy through scarcity. The taste of food became a measure of power. To eat well was to belong. To be denied was to be reminded of mortality. Harker, ever calm, observed from the shadows. His presence was felt even when unseen. He spoke little, yet every word or gesture was amplified by the fear it inspired. The forest, once an indifferent wilderness, had become an extension of his authority. Snow, trees, and silence conspired with him, shaping behavior, reinforcing obedience, and masking his true intent. I realized then the full horror of North Pine. It was a laboratory of the human psyche. Men were tested, broken, and remade. Some vanished, some adapted, some became. became instruments of control themselves, and I, recording every detail in my hidden ledger, understood that my survival depended not just on observation, but on comprehension. To know was dangerous. To act was even more so. The forest whispered its lessons through absence and silence. The camp had become a machine, precise and unforgiving, and I understood that the inner 12 were no longer men. They were the system incarnate, walking proof of the forest's dominion and Harker's mastery. Their transformation was complete, and the remaining men trembled under the weight of inevitability. That night I discovered the first token. A small wooden carving hidden beneath my bunk, etched with a saw blade wrapped in flame. At first I thought it was a warning, a threat left by some unseen hand. But over the following days it became clear that the token was part of the system, a symbol of transformation, of belonging, of the invisible hierarchy at work. It was neither reward nor punishment. It was recognition of compliance, a silent acknowledgement that one had understood the rules. Others received them too, though the process was subtle. A man might find one slipped into his coat pocket or tucked beneath his bedding, a cryptic sign that he had been observed and evaluated. The forest itself seemed complicit. Snow muffled sound, obscured footprints, and erased evidence, but the tokens remained, tangible reminders that no action, no thought, escaped the system's gaze. I began tracing patterns, noting who received tokens and when. Those elevated were often quiet, compliant, and observant. Men who had learned to internalize fear, obedience, and control. The tokens functioned as psychological anchors, connecting the inner 12 to Harker and to the unseen rules of North Pine. They were more than symbols. They were instruments of identity transformation. Hold one, and you were no longer just a man. You became part of a system older than the snow, older than the forest itself. The rituals surrounding the tokens were even more disturbing. Men would gather silently around a fire or at the edge of a snow-covered clearing, acknowledging the token without words, without overt action. Compliance was inferred, internalized, and observed. The process was subtle, yet absolute. The forest absorbed the hesitant, elevated the compliant, and erased dissent without noise. I realized then that these symbols were not mere reminders, they were tools of mastery. They imposed structure, hierarchy, and psychological control. A man holding a token was both observer and instrument, reinforcing the system by his very compliance. Those who did not understand, who questioned or resisted, disappeared quietly, erased by processes both human and natural, leaving no trace for the uninitiated. And so the forest and the camp, Harker, Braddock, Corley, Monroe, and even the snow itself were all instruments of transformation. Each token, each ritual, each disappearance was designed to teach a singular truth. Survival here depended not on strength or skill, but on comprehension, obedience, and the recognition of invisible hierarchies. By the 6th week, the tension had become almost tangible, like ice pressing against skin. The remaining men were restless, whispers growing more frequent, fear mingling with suspicion. They knew the forest had already claimed many, yet the pattern remained invisible to most, orchestrated, controlled, precise. The disappearances were no accidents, they were lessons, warnings etched in absence and silence. That evening I followed a small group of men to the southern line. They spoke in hushed tones about missing comrades, about the strange meals, the rituals with tokens, the orders that seemed to bend reality itself. Their fear was raw, palpable, almost infectious. I could see it in their eyes. A desperate search for logic in a system built entirely on control and obedience. Harker appeared without announcement. He emerged from the shadows like a figure carved from the forest itself. His presence silenced the murmurs instantly. No words were needed. A glance, a tilt of his head, a shift in posture. And the men's fear became obedience. Some stiffened, others bowed slightly, as if they had been trained to respond to invisible commands. I realized then that the forest and the camp were extensions of Harker, and that fear was merely another tool, wielded with surgical precision. Disappearance followed quickly. 2 men, bold enough to question rationing and task assignments, were sent into isolated woods the following day. They never returned. Only traces remained: a blood-stained glove, a single boot, drag marks in snow quickly erased by wind. The others watched silently, understanding without needing explanation. Dissent equaled removal. The forest had become an active participant, swallowing those who faltered, reinforcing the system with quiet cruelty. Braddock and Corley acted as intermediaries, ensuring that the remaining men internalized every lesson. Meals were measured, portions adjusted, the quality of food a constant reminder of hierarchy and allegiance. Those who had survived the token rituals were now observers and enforcers, complicit in the system without realizing the full scope of their transformation. The forest taught, Harker directed, and survival demanded silence and compliance. I, Elias Vaughan, kept my ledger hidden, recording every pattern, every manipulation, every disappearance. It was no longer merely a book of observations. It had become a testament to the forest's and Harker's mastery, a record of a system that reshaped men with invisible hands. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that the snow, the trees, and the silence itself were as much a part of the operation as any blade, ledger, or token. The inner 12 had become more than men. They were instruments of a system that demanded perfection in obedience. Every gesture, every glance, every shift in stance reinforced Harker's invisible architecture of control. They no longer spoke in casual tones. Their words were measured, deliberate, loaded with silent authority. The remaining men instinctively obeyed, their survival tied not to strength, but to the perception of alignment with the inner 12. Tasks grew harsher, assignments increasingly solitary, the forest itself weaponized against hesitation. One man, young and strong, was sent to fell a pine near a steep ravine, a task designed not merely to test skill, but to instill absolute attentiveness. He returned pale, silent, his hands trembling. The inner 12 observed without comment, but the lesson was unmistakable. Compliance was life, defiance was obliteration. Braddock's meals became an unspoken extension of this hierarchy. Portions were carefully calibrated to reward or suppress, subtly manipulating strength, energy, and morale. The inner 12 ate first, enjoying hearty stews and salted meats, their faces calm, their authority reinforced. Others received thin broths and dry biscuits, and in the quiet, the hunger became a weapon, teaching patience, obedience, and fear in equal measure. Corley and Monroe acted as executors of Harker's vision, implementing tasks that tested both body and mind. They sent men into blind corners of the forest, tracked absences, and ensured that the system's lessons were absorbed. Their presence reminded the remaining men that survival depended on understanding invisible rules, not questioning them. The forest, silent and indifferent, became a collaborator in this grand orchestration, erasing errors, hiding evidence, and amplifying dread. I documented it all in my hidden ledger, aware that my comprehension of the SIBO stem placed me in a precarious position. Observation was not passive, it was dangerous. To know too much was to risk exposure, yet not knowing was to be consumed by the forest, by Harker, by the unseen hierarchy. Each page I wrote captured more than names or actions. It recorded the subtle art of domination, the orchestration of fear, and the invisible transformation of men into tools of control. By this point, the inner 12's influence was absolute. Men no longer questioned assignments, they anticipated them. They monitored one another, silently enforcing rules too complex to be spoken aloud. The camp had become a laboratory of obedience, and I, a hidden witness, realized the terrifying precision of Harker's design. Survival here depended not on skill, but on understanding, internalizing, and perpetuating the system itself. It happened on a morning thick with snow, the forest muffling every sound except the crunch of boots on ice. Wexley Coates, one of the remaining men, was assigned to a task near the southern ridge, alone, unarmed, unprepared for what awaited. The inner 12 watched from a distance, silent, their expressions unreadable, their presence enough to anchor obedience and terror alike. By noon, Wexley had vanished. No screams, no struggle, only the faintest trace of his passage, a single glove half buried in the snow, a smear of blood frozen into the fabric. The others saw it immediately. Panic surged, but it was quickly suppressed by instinctive compliance. They knew questioning, hesitation, or pursuit would only mark them next. Harker's system had taught them well. Survival was predicated on internalizing rules, invisible yet absolute. Braddock and Corley appeared shortly after, moving with the calm precision of those who knew the forest's patterns intimately. They did not speak, did not explain. They retrieved the glove, handled it as carefully as they did the tokens, and disappeared back into the shadows. Silence fell heavier than snow. The remaining men understood that Wexley's disappearance was a ritualized lesson, a demonstration of control, a warning. It was not cruelty for its own sake. It was the forest's law, Harker's design, and the system's inexorable logic. I recorded every detail in my hidden ledger, aware that the very act of observation was both survival and risk. Wexley's absence was more than a name crossed off a list. It was a shift in the collective psyche. Fear transformed into anticipation. Doubt became adherence. Men no longer questioned instructions. They internalized them. The forest, the snow, the trees, the silence, all had become tools of transformation. That evening, the inner 12 gathered near the fire. Their calm, deliberate movements conveyed authority without words. The ritual had been observed, the lesson absorbed, and compliance cemented. Even the snow seemed to bend around them, covering evidence, erasing errors, leaving only the impression of inevitability. The remaining men ate their meager portions in silence, eyes flicking to the inner 12, understanding the unspoken hierarchy that had consumed Wexley and reshaped the camp. Harker's mastery was absolute. The inner 12 acted as extensions of his will, the forest as his enforcer, and the men as instruments molded by fear, obedience, and necessity. I realized then that North Pine was no longer a logging camp. It was a crucible. Men were tested, broken, and remade according to rules they could neither fully see nor question. And I, hidden in the shadows with my ledger, bore witness to it all, understanding the true depth of the system and the price of knowledge. By the 7th week, the camp had become a theater of obedience. The remaining men no longer acted as individuals. They were extensions of the system, each movement measured, each glance calculated. Fear had become internalized, no longer requiring overt enforcement. They monitored one another, enforcing compliance through silent observation, understanding that deviation could mean disappearance, or worse, being marked for the next ritual. Tasks grew more dangerous, yet participation became ritualized. A man assigned to fell a towering pine or haul logs across treacherous ice knew that his survival depended not only on skill, but on the perception of compliance. Hesitation was fatal, but anticipation of orders, unquestioning adherence, and alignment with the inner 12 were rewarded with continued existence. Strength alone meant nothing, only obedience ensured life. Braddock and Corley acted as architects of this transformation, ensuring the men internalized lessons without ever explicitly stating them. Meals, rations, and tokens became instruments of psychological control. Those who ate well, received tokens, or were singled out for observation grew stronger, more confident, and more complicit. Those overlooked weakened, their energy sapped, their morale eroded, a constant reminder that survival depended on more than brute force. I watched as subtle shifts occurred in behavior. Men who had once joked or questioned orders now spoke in measured tones. The very act of thought was policed, and self-regulation became mandatory. Compliance was no longer a choice. It was embedded in every action, reinforced by observation and ritual. The forest, the snow, and the camp had become silent enforcers, shaping men into instruments of hierarchy, fear, and obedience. And then came the first explicit collaboration. One evening, the inner 12 were observed quietly directing a smaller group to retrieve supplies from the far reaches of the forest. They moved without hesitation, their faces masks of stoic efficiency. Yet the weight of understanding was visible. They knew the consequences of failure. Each man carried the system within him now, not merely as a set of instructions, but as an internalized law, invisible yet unbreakable. I recorded every detail in my ledger, knowing that my awareness was both power and danger. The forest had not merely consumed men physically, it had transformed their minds, restructured their hierarchy, and created a new order, one where fear, observation, and silent compliance reigned supreme. The inner 12 were no longer men. They were instruments of a design far older than the snow, far older than the camp itself, and I, Elias Vaughan, remained a witness, the only one recording the hidden mechanisms of this dark system, understanding fully that knowledge itself was a currency of survival. The inner 12 had become arbiters of life and death, moving through the camp with a quiet authority that no one dared challenge. They no longer waited for Harker's direction. Their actions anticipated his will, executing it with precision. Orders were rarely spoken aloud. They were inferred, internalized, understood through a subtle choreography of glances, gestures, and positioning. One morning, a man named Callan was sent alone to check the supply sleds near the northern ridge. He had spoken out of turn the night before, questioning the dwindling rations. By noon, Callan had vanished. The men at the camp did not panic. They merely observed, learning through silent absorption what hesitation or dissent truly cost. The snow erased footprints quickly, leaving only a faint crimson stain on the white canvas, a lesson visible yet inscrutable, terrifying yet necessary. Braddock's kitchen became an extension of this system. Meals were meticulously calculated to manipulate energy, morale, and obedience. The inner 12 ate first, receiving the richest portions, while others were left with minimal sustenance. Hunger became another instrument of control, sharpening focus, reinforcing hierarchy, and internalizing the understanding that survival was contingent on alignment with the inner 12's expectations. Corley and Monroe acted as enforcers, ensuring the pattern continued. They monitored men, reassigned tasks, and subtly punished deviation. The forest itself conspired with them. Steep slopes, hidden ravines, and unstable snowdrifts made mistakes fatal, yet only to those who had not internalized the rules. Survival depended not on skill, but on assimilation into the hierarchy, on reading invisible currents of command, on becoming a living extension of the system itself. I, Elias Vaughan, remained in the shadows with my ledger, recording every disappearance, every shift in behavior, every subtle act of psychological control. Observation had become a weapon, but also a risk. To know too much was dangerous, yet to remain ignorant was lethal. The forest, the inner 12, Harker, all were elements of a design far older than the snow, far more intricate than a simple logging operation. By the end of that week, the remaining men were no longer merely laborers. They were participants in a system that demanded obedience, enforced through fear, and orchestrated through absence. The forest, the snow, and the inner 12 had reshaped them into instruments of control, silently observing and enforcing the rules of survival. And I, the clerk who had once only recorded numbers, now bore witness to a truth far darker than any ledger could contain. The operation was complete, and the forest had claimed its final apprentices. By this point, fear alone was insufficient. The inner 12 needed participation. Survival required more than silent obedience. It demanded complicity. Assignments were no longer simple labor. They became tests of psychological endurance, requiring the remaining men to act as instruments in Harker's system. Each task blurred the line between survival and ritual, obedience and enforcement. One afternoon, a small group was sent to the ice pit behind the cookhouse. Their task appeared mundane: organize barrels and crates. Yet beneath the frozen surface, hidden depths waited, secrets that would transform perception. Braddock oversaw them, his movements precise, his gaze unreadable. Corley instructed them on the proper handling of certain crates, emphasizing care, focus, and quiet efficiency. The men felt the weight of unseen consequences. One misstep could mark them as expendable. As they worked, the inner 12 observed, cataloging reactions, gauging composure, and subtly adjusting tasks to maximize pressure. A man who hesitated too long was reassigned to a solitary, dangerous post. Another who showed excessive curiosity was guided toward a task that ensured both labor and observation. Obedience was no longer about avoiding punishment. It became a test of endurance, loyalty, and psychological resilience. Meals and rations reinforced the hierarchy. The inner 12 dined first, consuming hearty portions and exchanging silent nods that reinforced authority. The remaining men ate last, their portions thin, their energy drained, their attention sharpened by hunger. Braddock's stews carried lessons as subtle as the flicker of a candle, each bite reinforcing the understanding that survival required alignment with the system, and that deviation would be punished, not always visibly, but always effectively. I watched, ledger in hand, as the men transformed before my eyes. They were no longer passive workers. They were participants in a hierarchy that demanded internalized compliance. The Forest Harker and the Inner 12 were sculpting them into instruments, tools capable of enforcing the rules on one another, ensuring the system perpetuated itself. At night, I recorded everything: reactions, assignments, absences, and the subtle cues that orchestrated fear and compliance. Each page captured the evolution of men from laborers into controlled operatives, silent enforcers of a system designed to break and rebuild simultaneously. The North Pine camp had ceased to be merely a logging operation. It had become a crucible, a laboratory of obedience, and I, Elias Vaughan, the solitary witness, began to understand that knowledge itself was now both a weapon and a curse. The Inner 12 had reached the point where fear and complicity alone were not enough. They needed a demonstration, an event that would bind obedience, loyalty, and terror into a single, unforgettable lesson. That morning, the men were assembled under the guise of routine work assignments. Nothing seemed unusual. The forest, silent and white, offered no warning. Harker's gaze swept across the remaining laborers with quiet calculation. Corley and Monroe moved among the men, subtly guiding them toward specific positions, ensuring every eye could witness what would unfold. Braddock remained in the shadows near the cookhouse, observing, his hands occasionally brushing a blade concealed beneath his coat. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath, the snow muffling sound and masking movement, complicit in the design. The chosen man, a quiet Swede named Anders, was instructed to retrieve supplies from a distant clearing, a task no one dared question. He moved with the obedience ingrained by weeks of silent enforcement. The Inner 12 followed at a distance, orchestrating every step without the need for spoken orders. I trailed them, ledger in hand, knowing this event would reveal the true depth of the system. Anders never returned. The forest swallowed him in silence. Drag marks were faint, almost invisible beneath fresh snow. The remaining men noticed immediately, but instead of panic, they absorbed a lesson. Disappearance was not random. It was methodical, a consequence of deviation or exposure, reinforcing the invisible hierarchy. Fear became a shared, internalized truth, binding every man to the system. That evening, the Inner 12 gathered the men near the fire, their expressions unreadable, their presence a constant assertion of authority. No explanation was offered, no comfort given. The lesson had been delivered. Obedience was no longer optional, it was survival. The remaining men understood that compliance meant life, hesitation meant erasure, and participation meant perpetuation. I recorded every detail, aware that my ledger had become a map of power, control, and terror. The North Pine camp was no longer a place of labor. It was a crucible of psychological engineering. Each disappearance, each ration, each glance enforced the system, and each man's mind became a tool for its perpetuation. Knowledge itself, what I bore witness to, had become a dangerous currency. To record it was to survive. To ignore it was to vanish. The forest had claimed Anders, and in doing so, it had reshaped the remaining men. They were no longer laborers. They were instruments of the Inner 12, enforcers of rules invisible yet absolute, and I, Elias Vaughan, remained the sole chronicler, understanding fully that what I had seen could never be unseen, and what I had recorded could never be ignored. By the 8th week, the Inner 12 had transformed North Pine into a chamber of ritualized control. Labor alone no longer defined the men's existence. Every task, every glance, every bite of food became part of a system designed to reshape thought, perception, and loyalty. The forest, the snow, and the camp itself were complicit, each element reinforcing obedience through subtle, unavoidable pressure. Morning assemblies had become exercises in psychological conditioning. Men were instructed in precise movements, correct postures, and silent acknowledgements. Small deviations, a hesitation, a sideways glance, a whispered question, were noted and corrected by the inner 12, often without a word. The lesson was implicit. Conformity ensured survival, deviation ensured erasure. Each man learned to police himself, internalizing the hierarchy before it was ever externally enforced. Braddock's kitchen had evolved into a laboratory of compliance. Meals were distributed with meticulous attention. Who received meat? Who received broth? Who received a token hidden beneath a plate? All calculated to shape behavior and enforce submission. Hunger and satiety became instruments of control, sharpening awareness and reinforcing the invisible hierarchy. I watched the men grow thin, lean, alert, their minds more attuned to the rhythms of the system than to instinct or conscience. The inner 12 introduced tasks that appeared arbitrary, but carried weight far beyond their physical demand. Men were sent into treacherous sections of the forest under the guise of work, observing how they handled danger, monitoring their composure under isolation, and noting subtle signs of fear or hesitation. Those who faltered were not punished openly. Instead, their weaknesses were catalogued, and future assignments ensured reinforcement of obedience through risk, repetition, and psychological stray. I chronicled it all in my ledger, understanding that knowledge itself had become both weapon and curse. The forest had claimed bodies, but the system had claimed minds. The remaining men were no longer individuals. They were extensions of a design orchestrated by Harker and maintained through the inner 12. Their compliance was complete, their autonomy eroded, and their fear internalized. And yet, amid this orchestrated terror, I remained the witness. Every observation, every recorded detail, every subtle nuance of indoctrination was a testament to a process that was more than survival. It was transformation. And as I wrote, I realized that the forest had not only claimed men physically, but had built an invisible hierarchy of obedience, and those who remained alive were now bound to it in body, mind, and soul. By now, the inner 12 had mastered the art of psychological dominance. Fear alone had evolved into something more potent, symbolic reinforcement. Objects, gestures, and subtle cues became tools, silently communicating authority, compliance, and consequence. A carved token placed beneath a bunk, a folded paper on a table, a blade resting at a particular angle, each item a sign, a message, a test. Men began to recognize the patterns. Some called them omens, others instructions. Hesitation or misinterpretation could be fatal. The forest amplified their paranoia. Shadows shifted, snow concealed tracks, and distant creaks of ice became warnings. Every sound, every movement, every absence reinforced the hierarchy. Those who survived learned to internalize the system, reading its invisible signs as if instinctive. Braddock's kitchen now functioned as both sustenance and indoctrination. Certain dishes contained subtle markers: the color of broth, the placement of herbs, the shape of meat cuts. Signals that the inner 12 monitored closely. Men learned quickly to interpret these cues. To eat without attention was to invite scrutiny. To hesitate was to reveal weakness. Obedience became second nature, survival depended on it. The inner 12 also orchestrated small disappearances, controlled exercises to reinforce vigilance. A man would vanish for hours or a day, reappearing only after the remaining men had internalized the anxiety his absence produced. These staged events ensured the hierarchy remained vivid, immediate, and inescapable. Observers, including myself, recorded each reaction, each subtle adjustment in behavior. I began leaving coded entries in my ledger, not just records, but maps of thought and perception. The forest, Harker, the inner 12, and the men themselves had become a system that demanded participation. Observation was a form of survival, comprehension a form of defense, and I understood fully that knowledge, once acquired, was as dangerous as the snow, the forest, or the inner 12 themselves. That night, I paused, reflecting on the subtle terror woven into every action. The men were no longer simply surviving. They were being remade, trained, tested, and bound to a system they could neither escape nor fully understand. The Inner 12 had transformed North Pine into a crucible of obedience, where mind, body, and perception were instruments of control, and I, Elias Vaughn, remained its sole witness, chronicling the transformation that was as inevitable as the snow itself. The Inner 12 had moved beyond control through fear and observation. They introduced ritual, precise symbolic acts designed to bind the men's obedience, loyalty, and fear into one unbreakable system. Each morning, assignments were distributed not merely by labor necessity but by subtle calculation: who would witness, who would execute, and who would absorb the lesson. The forest, endless and indifferent, became both stage and participant. One ritual involved the marking of tools and equipment. Axes, saws, and sleds were arranged in patterns only the Inner 12 fully understood. A crooked blade, a misaligned sled, a misfolded rope was never accidental. Observers, often the remaining men themselves, learned that even the slightest misstep could signal defiance or weakness. Compliance was no longer voluntary. It was embedded in thought, in gesture, in every decision made under the snow-laden canopy. Braddock's kitchen contributed to the indoctrination. Meals became ceremonial. Each serving carried cues: a twist of meat here, a folded parchment there. Some items were hidden in crates, their presence noted only by those trained to observe. The men's survival depended on deciphering these symbols correctly. Failure to recognize the meaning could result in reassignment to hazardous posts or subtle social exclusion, a calculated psychological punishment that reinforced hierarchy without overt violence. Disappearance and return were now ritualized. Men sent on isolated tasks in the forest were observed indirectly. Their absence and eventual reappearance created an invisible tension, a constant reminder that the Inner 12's authority was absolute, omnipresent. Eyes tracked movement, glances recorded reaction, and loyalty was confirmed through silent compliance. Every man learned that survival meant alignment with the system, deviation meant erasure. I continued my meticulous documentation, aware that my ledger had become more than a record. It was a map of control, a chronicle of manipulation, a testament to the ways a man could be reshaped by fear, ritual, and observation. The North Pine camp was no longer simply a logging site. It had become a crucible of obedience, a laboratory of psychological engineering. That night, I observed the Inner 12 in a quiet convergence behind the cookhouse. Their coordination, precise and wordless, projected dominance across the camp. Every glance they exchanged, every motion they made, was a lesson in control. The remaining men, silent and watchful, had internalized the hierarchy. North Pine was no longer a place of labor. It was a temple of obedience, and each man within it a living instrument of the Inner 12's design. By the 9th week, it was no longer enough for the men to follow orders or decipher symbols. The Inner 12 began testing their moral and ethical boundaries, forcing decisions that blurred right and wrong, survival and complicity. Each task was designed to reveal who could endure, who could adapt, and who would falter under pressure. The forest had become both classroom and confessional, its silent trees witnessing the transformation of men into instruments of obedience. One morning, a small group of men was assigned to collect supplies from the far edge of the basin. Among the supplies were crates marked with familiar names, labels that implied choice, ownership, and trust. Yet inside, the contents were never what they seemed: rotting meat, empty containers, or items previously hoarded by Braddock for reasons unknown. Decisions had to be made. Distributors ordered: conceal the truth, or rebel and risk immediate observation. Each choice revealed character, obedience, and alignment with the hierarchy. Harker's presence was subtle yet omnipresent. He never interfered openly but orchestrated outcomes from a distance, ensuring that every moral test reinforced the system. Observers, often men themselves, recorded reactions silently. Compliance was rewarded with small privileges, while hesitation drew unseen scrutiny. In time, the men internalized the hierarchy so deeply that they began policing themselves, anticipating the inner 12's expectations without explicit orders. Even the simplest acts became exercises in loyalty and vigilance. A man might notice a misplaced log, a misaligned sled, or a missing tool. Reporting it correctly reinforced submission. Misreporting or failure to act suggested weakness or dissent. The forest, blanketed in snow, was a perfect amplifier. Every sound, every shadow, every absence became a test. Decisions carried weight far beyond immediate survival. I documented each test meticulously, aware that my ledger had become a blueprint of control and submission. Every man at North Pine was now trapped in a system where ethical ambiguity, observation, and fear worked in tandem to reshape thought and behavior. Survival demanded more than strength. It demanded comprehension, adaptability, and alignment. That night, I paused in my records cabin, realizing the full scope of what I had witnessed. The inner 12 were not merely surviving, they were engineering obedience, reshaping men into instruments of a system that consumed individuality, conscience, and instinct. Every disappearance, every ration, every subtle cue had a purpose. And the remaining men, consciously or not, were now participants in a cycle from which there would be no return. The inner 12 had perfected a system that combined psychological pressure with controlled displays of violence. The forest itself became an accomplice, hiding bodies, masking sounds, and concealing the edges of the camp where fate could be administered without witnesses. The remaining men learned quickly. Obedience brought small rewards. Hesitation invited elimination. Survival had become a negotiation with fear itself. One evening, a man named Calder was assigned to the southern edge alone, near a ravine hidden beneath snow. He hesitated briefly at the lip, unsure of the footing, and the inner 12 observed from a distance. When he faltered, a calculated accident occurred. A sled shifted, a log fell, bruising him but not fatally. The lesson was clear. Strength alone was meaningless. Control, compliance, and calculated courage were the true measures of survival. Braddock's kitchen remained a silent theater of conditioning. Meat was distributed strategically, some portions richer, some deliberately sparse. Men learned to interpret these signals, connecting sustenance with performance and submission. Those who received larger portions worked harder, not out of hunger, but to maintain favor and avoid suspicion. Scarcity became a tool, invisibly shaping behavior and thought. The inner 12 also orchestrated scenarios that forced men to witness consequences for others' hesitation or disobedience. A man might disappear for hours, only to return marked, bruised, bloodied, or carrying a token signaling his failure or compliance. Observation alone became a form of punishment and instruction. Every man internalized these lessons, policing himself and others to avoid becoming the next example. I documented everything in my ledger, aware that my words were both shield and witness. The forest had claimed lives, but the inner 12 had claimed minds. Fear alone was insufficient. It had been refined into a system where reward, observation, and orchestrated risk intertwined to produce absolute compliance. Each act of violence, each measured reward, reinforced the hierarchy and deepened the men's psychological submission. By the end of that week, the remaining men were no longer simply surviving the forest. They were instruments of a carefully calibrated system, molded through fear, ritual, and reward. North Pine was no longer a logging camp. It was a laboratory of obedience, a place where human will was dissected and reconstructed. And I, Elias Vaughan, remained its solitary witness, chronicling the unseen machinery that governed every breath, step, and thought. By the 10th week, the inner 12 introduced the first symbolic ceremony, a ritual that transformed obedience from private compliance into public affirmation. It was subtle, yet its weight was immense. Men were called to the clearing at dusk, the snow absorbing every step and breath. A circle was formed, faint marks in the snow creating invisible boundaries. The remaining men, silent and apprehensive, waited while the inner 12 assumed positions at the center, their faces unreadable, their movements precise. Each man was given a simple object, a carved token, a folded scrap of paper, or a length of twine. On the surface, the items seemed innocuous, but in the hands of the inner 12, Each became a measure of loyalty, a test of comprehension, and a symbol of alignment. To mishandle the object, to hesitate, to fail to mimic a subtle gesture, was to reveal doubt, a weakness that could be exploited. The ritual began quietly. One by one, men stepped into the circle, performing prescribed movements, aligning themselves with the invisible rules they had learned to sense but never fully understood. Eyes flicked, heads tilted, hands adjusted. The inner 12 observed, noting every misstep, every pause, every unintended glance. The forest, silent and indifferent, seemed to lean closer, amplifying the tension, holding every breath hostage. Braddock's presence was felt, though he remained in the shadows, distributing food tokens at precise intervals, reinforcing that reward and compliance were intertwined. Harker watched from the periphery, his gaze calm but penetrating, reminding every man that the system extended beyond the circle, beyond the forest, and beyond individual will. Survival depended not only on skill or strength, but on complete alignment with the hierarchy the inner 12 commanded. I recorded every motion, every token, every subtle adjustment in my laos. Edger. It was no longer enough to witness obedience. I had to decode it, map its logic and understand its implications. The ritual revealed the depth of psychological control. Men had internalized fear, loyalty, and hierarchy to the point that survival and submission were indistinguishable. That night, as the men returned to their bunks, I reflected on the transformation. They were no longer simply surviving. They were performing obedience, a dance choreographed by the inner 12, where every movement had meaning and every misstep carried consequence. North Pine was no longer a logging camp. It was a crucible of human will, a theater of psychological engineering, and I remained the sole witness chronicling the invisible chains that bound every man's mind, body, and soul. The next stage of control emerged silently, insidiously. The inner 12 began enforcing secrets, small confessions, carefully chosen admissions of doubt, fear, or past mistakes. These were not punishments. They were tools to fragment trust, isolate thought, and consolidate obedience. Every man became both participant and observer, a witness to the fractures they themselves helped create. One evening, Harker called a private meeting with a handful of men. The forest muffled the sound of their boots on snow, but I followed at a distance, careful to remain unseen. In whispered tones, men revealed minor transgressions, a loaf of bread hidden, a moment of hesitation, a glance that lingered too long. The inner 12 listened, recorded nothing on paper, yet the consequences were immediate. Trust fractured, alliances dissolved, and the men learned that exposure, not the act itself, carried the ultimate weight. Braddock reinforced the system through sustenance. Portions were selectively distributed based on compliance, loyalty, and the secrets men carried. A man who admitted a minor failure might receive a larger ration, a silent reward for demonstrating alignment. Those who withheld, even subtly, found themselves shivering with scarcity, understanding instinctively that omission could be as dangerous as defiance. Every whispered confession created a network of surveillance. Men began observing one another not for camaraderie, but for survival. Eyes measured reactions, glances weighed intentions, and subtle gestures carried profound meaning. Compliance was no longer personal, it had become communal, a necessity dictated by the invisible hand of the inner 12. The forest itself amplified the tension. Isolation, silence, and the endless white expanse ensured every word and movement mattered. I chronicled every detail in my ledger, aware that my writings might be the only record of this orchestration. North Pine was no longer merely a site of labor and survival. It was a laboratory of obedience, secrecy, and psychological engineering. Each confession, each ration, each observation was a thread in the web the inner 12 wove, ensnaring every mind and shaping the men into extensions of their will. That night, I sat alone, pondering the scope of the system. The inner 12 had transformed fear into ritual, obedience into performance, and secrecy into surveillance. Every man at North Pine was trapped, not just by snow, hunger, or isolation, but by a carefully constructed hierarchy of trust, knowledge, and submission. Survival demanded allegiance, and allegiance demanded internalization. The forest had claimed bodies before, but now it claimed minds, shaping them into instruments of a design none but the inner 12 fully understood. It happened without warning. One morning, a man named Duval, steady and reliable, failed to report to his post. His bunk lay empty, boots gone, tools untouched. Initially, we assumed a mistake, a wandering step lost in the snow, but Harker's calm, unreadable demeanor shattered that hope. No search was ordered, no alarm was raised. The inner 12 had decided the lesson, and the forest would deliver it. Men glanced at one another with silent terror. Duval's absence was not merely a disappearance, it was a message. Fear shifted, deeper than before, wrapping itself around every thought, every hesitation, every breath. Work continued mechanically, yet the rhythm of the camp changed, faster, sharper, more precise. Every motion carried scrutiny. Every misstep hinted at the same fate awaiting anyone who failed the unseen standards. Braddock served stew that evening, darker than usual, rich with a subtle metallic taste. No one questioned it. Silence had become ritual. The men ate, aware that the forest had just claimed one of their own, yet incapable of voicing suspicion. The inner 12 observed from the shadows, eyes trained to detect the faintest tremor in composure, the slightest hesitation in thought or action. I recorded everything meticulously, aware that my ledger was now more than ink and paper. It was proof, of patterns, of intentions, of the invisible hands shaping the camp's reality. Duval's disappearance confirmed what I had suspected for weeks. Survival was not about strength, skill, or endurance. It was about understanding, adapting, and aligning completely with the system. Failure to do so was met not with words, but with erasure. The remaining men grew quieter, more rigid. Conversation ceased. Laughter vanished entirely, replaced by a tension that seemed to pulse with the very heartbeat of the forest. Even the air felt heavier, the snow oppressive. Pressing down as if complicit in the hierarchy. Compliance had become instinct. Observation had become a second nature. Fear was no longer a warning, it was an integral part of thought. That night, I traced Duval's last steps, noting every detail, every shadow, every indistinct drag in the snow. The truth was brutal and simple. The inner 12 controlled more than work schedules or rations. They controlled perception, trust, and reality itself. The forest was merely their stage, and we, the remaining men, were performers in a drama we had never agreed to act in. By now, the camp had transformed into something unrecognizable. Fear was no longer external. It had seeped into the marrow of every man, dictating thought, movement, and speech. The inner 12 had pushed the boundaries of control so subtly, so precisely, that loyalty became instinct and survival was synonymous with submission. The forest, snow, and isolation were no longer the threats. The real danger was the invisible hierarchy, perfected over weeks of calculated pressure. The men moved with mechanical precision, performing tasks with eyes lowered, hands steady, and expressions unreadable. Conversation had dwindled to necessities. Silence dominated, a language everyone had learned. Even laughter, once a brief rebellion, had vanished. In its place, men measured their every action, constantly calculating alignment with the unspoken rules dictated by the inner 12. Braddock's role had evolved. Meals were carefully curated instruments of conditioning. Portions, timing, and presentation reinforced hierarchy, compliance, and loyalty. A glance toward the wrong man could result in subtle deprivation. A correct gesture brought favor, reinforcing behavior without words. Hunger, scarcity, and reward were no longer survival tools. They were instruments of absolute psychological mastery. I documented it all in my ledger, my only witness to the invisible mechanisms at work. Each entry revealed the depth of manipulation. The inner 12 had engineered obedience so total that fear, reward, and performance merged into a singular, unbreakable system. Men no longer questioned, hesitated, or resisted. Compliance had become identity, survival was loyalty, and loyalty was the only path forward. That night, I observed a subtle ritual I had not seen before. Men without instruction began organizing their tools, stacking firewood, and aligning supplies in exact uniform patterns, and their movements mirrored the Inner Twelve's discipline, a reflection of the control they had internalized. The forest, once a neutral expanse, had become a canvas on which the hierarchy painted itself in every gesture, every task, every measured breath. By the end of the week, it was clear. The survivors were no longer men bound by circumstance. They were instruments of a system molded to perform, think, and act within the invisible architecture of obedience. North Pine was no longer a logging camp. It was a crucible of human will, fear, and power. And I, Elias Vaughan, remained the only witness capable of revealing the terrifying truth. Survival in that forest demanded more than endurance. It demanded transformation, complete and irreversible. The culmination of the Inner Twelve's control came suddenly, yet with chilling precision. They called the remaining men to the central clearing under the pretense of a final inventory check. The snow, thick and unbroken, muffled every sound, isolating the camp in an eerie silence. Men approached reluctantly, aware of the invisible weight pressing upon them, the unspoken lesson that the forest itself had become a mirror of their obedience. At the center of the clearing, a long table had been set, carved from freshly felled pine, its surface bare except for a single object, a circular medallion etched with a flame entwined around a saw blade, the same symbol I had found earlier beneath my bunk. Its presence was deliberate, a final test, a token demanding recognition and allegiance. Harker, as always, observed from the periphery, his posture calm, his expression unreadable. Braddock and the Inner 12 positioned themselves around the table. One by one, men were summoned to approach, pick up the medallion, and trace the etching with their thumb. The gesture, seemingly simple, carried immense significance: acknowledgement, submission, and alignment. Those who hesitated were met with subtle, almost imperceptible scrutiny. The forest seemed to lean closer, snow-laden branches pressing in, amplifying the tension. Each man performed the ritual with mechanical precision, aware that survival and status within the hierarchy now hinged on this single act. By touching the symbol, they were not only affirming obedience, they were internalizing it. The line between willing compliance and coerced complicity had vanished. I watched from the shadows, my ledger open, recording each step, each reaction, each micro-expression. The transformation was absolute. Fear had become devotion. Observation had become instinct. Survival had merged with ritual. Each man now carried the imprint of the Inner 12, a permanent mark on mind and body, an unbreakable chain forged in snow, silence, and obedience. That night, as men returned to their bunks, the medallion remained on the table, untouched yet potent, a silent reminder of what had been achieved. I traced the symbol again in my mind, understanding its true purpose. Control had been cemented, not through violence or coercion alone, but through ritual, observation, and the meticulous shaping of thought. North Pine was no longer a place of labor. It was a cathedral of psychological mastery, and the survivors were both congregation and instrument. I urge you, as you listen, to pause and consider this. Comment twice below the phrase, "flame in the snow." Let it anchor your awareness and engage with this truth. Recognize it, own it. Understand the depths of human compliance and the power hidden in plain sight. In the days that followed, the transformation completed itself. The survivors were no longer merely workers in a logging camp. They were components of a living mechanism, extensions of the Inner 12's strategy. Every step, every swing of an axe, every placement of a log had become ritualized, precise, and accountable. Not to the company, not even to the camp itself, but to the invisible hierarchy that ruled silently, invisibly, and absolutely. The forest, once a neutral expanse, had been converted into a theater of control. Snowdrifts, hidden ravines, and the oppressive canopy of trees became both walls and instruments of discipline. Men learned instinctively to navigate these traps, to measure each stride, each movement, and each glance. Survival depended not only on skill but on conformity. Deviance, hesitation, or independent thought risked not punishment alone, but disappearance, absorption into the system in a way that left no trace. Braddock's role deepened. His meals were no longer mere sustenance. They were symbols of favor and judgment. Each portion, each serving, reinforced hierarchy. Men who adhered fully were nourished. Those who faltered went hungry. I observed the subtle exchanges, glances that measured loyalty, gestures that communicated compliance, and the silent acknowledgement that the Inner Twelve's design had been internalized. The Inner Twelve themselves became ghostly overseers, present yet absent. They needed no words. Their authority had been absorbed, integrated into the camp's rhythm. The forest, snow, and isolation were now instruments of obedience. Men moved like shadows of themselves, performing actions with exacting precision, unaware they had become both prisoners and agents of a system they could no longer escape. I, Elias Vaughan, chronicled everything, knowing that this ledger was perhaps the only record that would survive the orchestrated erasure of men and events. Every detail, the silent meals, the whispered confessions, the precise gestures of ritual, painted a portrait of psychological mastery beyond ordinary understanding. North Pine had become a cathedral of control, and the survivors were both its foundation and its choir, trained to sing without ever questioning the song. The lesson was irreversible. Compliance had fused with identity. Fear had fused with ritual. The forest was no longer a backdrop. It was a participant, shaping thought, behavior, and allegiance. Those who remained were no longer men in the conventional sense. They were instruments of a system whose design was total, deliberate, and terrifyingly effective. The final test arrived silently, without fanfare or warning. One morning, Harker summoned the remaining men to the northern ridge, beyond the familiar clearing, where the snow lay deep and unbroken. There were no orders, only expectation. Each man knew instinctively that hesitation or doubt would be noted, remembered, and punished, not by words, but by consequence. At the ridge, the evidence of the Inner Twelve's method became undeniable. Beneath the thin crust of snow, outlines of drag marks, frozen stains, and scattered remnants of the disappeared men were revealed. Duval, Wexley, Ryland, Arvd Knudsen, all gone, all absorbed into the system, their existence reduced to pattern, lesson, and warning. The forest itself had become an executor, an accomplice in the design of absolute obedience. Harker stood at the edge of the ridge, calm and unmoving, eyes surveying the frozen tableau. The men traced the remnants with silent recognition, each understanding the stakes. Survival was no longer a matter of skill or strength. It was alignment with a structure that demanded complete psychological integration. The Inner Twelve had orchestrated every absence, every disappearance, every subtle shift in mood. Every act, no matter how minor, had been a step toward shaping the camp into a living instrument of control. Braddock, Corley, and the others watched from behind, silent guardians of the system, ensuring no deviation. The ritual of the medallion, the carefully measured meals, the encoded schedules, all led to this moment. Those outside the Inner Twelve were expendable, necessary sacrifices to maintain structure, loyalty, and obedience. The forest had tested, refined, and eliminated the weak, leaving only the instruments capable of perfect compliance. As the men returned to the camp, the weight of understanding settled like ice in their chests. Every glance, every measure, step, every action had been scrutinized. The line between free will and enforced alignment had vanished. North Pine was no longer a logging camp. It was a crucible of psychological mastery, and those who survived were now irrevocably bound to the Inner Twelve system. I recorded every detail, knowing the ledger held the only testimony of what had transpired. The forest had become a teacher, the snow a silent enforcer, and the Inner Twelve the unseen architects of an order beyond conventional comprehension. Survival had demanded more than endurance. It had demanded total transformation, and there was no returning to the world outside. By now, the survivors had become extensions of the Inner Twelve's design. Every motion, every thought, and every glance had been calibrated by the invisible architecture of control. The forest, snow, and isolation were no longer mere setting. They had transformed into instruments of permanent psychological dominance, shaping instinct, behavior, and allegiance with precision. The men moved through the camp with the quiet efficiency of those who had internalized every rule, every nuance, and every expectation. Even minor deviations were corrected by subtle cues. A glance from Harker, a shift in Braddock's posture, a measured nod from Corley. Compliance was no longer optional, it had fused with identity. Survival was inseparable from obedience, and obedience had become instinct. Meals continued as ritualized instruments of control. Each portion, each serving, was a reinforcement of hierarchy. Those who fully embraced the structure were nourished, mentally and physically, while those who faltered were subtly punished, denied resources, observed and adjusted. Every action became a reflection of alignment with the inner 12 system. The survivors' minds and bodies were honed, conditioned and perfected by a system so precise that resistance became inconceivable. The forest itself seemed complicit. Snowdrifts hid danger, ravines enforced caution, and the trees stood as silent witnesses, reinforcing the omnipresence of surveillance. Men learned to anticipate the expectations, to measure each movement, and to internalize the ritualized obedience demanded by Harker's invisible architecture. North Pine was no longer a logging camp. It was a cathedral of human control, a living laboratory of psychological mastery. I, Elias Vaughan, remained the sole chronicler, recording the evolution of the survivors into instruments of the system. Every gesture, every ritual, every expression revealed the extent of manipulation. The forest had become a teacher, the snow a silent enforcer, and the inner 12 the ultimate architects of transformation. By the end of this phase, there was no turning back. Every man had been reshaped, not broken, not punished, but remade in the image of absolute compliance. And yet, for all the apparent perfection, a shadow lingered, a question of what remained of the men before the system. Identity had fused with obedience, and the forest would never relinquish its role. North Pine was no longer just a place. It was a permanent instrument of psychological domination, and the survivors were both its subjects and its guardians, bound eternally by ritual, fear, and allegiance. Decades later, the story of North Pine vanished from public record, buried beneath snow, time, and deliberate erasure. The forest, silent and unyielding, remained as it had been, a cathedral of obedience, a witness to human transformation, and a reminder of the unseen architecture of control. The 12 who had survived were never seen together again. Some returned to society, but each carried an invisible ledger etched into their minds, every action measured against a system that had remade them entirely. They spoke little of what had transpired, yet the weight of the inner 12's design never left them. Dreams were haunted by frozen ravines, the faint scent of iron, and the memory of ritualized meals and silent medallions. Survival had demanded more than strength or endurance. It demanded assimilation. Each man had become a living instrument, calibrated to a rhythm of obedience so absolute that even freedom felt alien. Harker, Braddock, and the inner 12 faded into obscurity, yet their influence persisted. North Pine was no longer a logging camp. It had become a proving ground, a laboratory of the mind, and a template for understanding how isolation, ritual, and subtle orchestration can bend even strong men to a singular purpose. The forest had done its work, and in doing so, it had revealed a terrifying truth, that human will is malleable, identity negotiable, and that survival itself can be weaponized as a tool of psychological mastery. And so, the final lesson remains. One not recorded in company ledgers or legal documents, but in the very essence of those who survived. Obedience, when refined through ritual, environment, and subtle enforcement, can remake a man completely. Control can be invisible, but its effects are indelible. North Pine serves as a warning. That power, when exercised quietly and precisely, can transform entire lives without a single act of violence. As you listen, consider this carefully. The forest, the snow, the silent overseers, they are more than history. They are a mirror. Look closely. Understand the mechanisms of obedience, the rituals of compliance, and the invisible hierarchies that shape thought and behavior. Recognize the truth hidden in plain sight and the lasting imprint of systems designed not to punish, but to remake. North Pine is gone, yet its lesson endures. A chilling testament to the price of survival, the power of structure, and the unbreakable chains of psychological mastery.